Good morning and welcome to the first University Women's Club lecture of the season. I'm Tamara Van Spreel, president of the University Women's Club for the 21-22 program year. I'd like to personally invite each one of you to consider joining us at the University Women's Club this year. If you join, an added benefit is that you'll be included in the November issue if you're joined by this Friday, October 15th. We have a number of interesting activities planned and opportunities to engage with other bright, active women. We have 5 lectures scheduled on a wide range of topics of interest. The November lecture will be a webinar as well, but we're hoping to get back to in-person lecture luncheons after the first of the year. Everything depends on how we can best keep everyone safe while continuing our programming. So we'll cross our fingers and hope we can get back in person. In addition to the lecture luncheons, there are opportunities to participate in more than 20 interest groups. And it's such a wide variety of offerings. When you see the list of activities, you'll undoubtedly want to be involved in more than one, I'm sure. Currently, the nominating committee is looking for good candidates to serve on the board next year. And we also are soliciting nominees for the prestigious Margaret Willard Award. The Margaret Willard Award, named after the first president of the club, is an honor bestowed on women who have distinguished themselves in her profession and in the community. This award is presented annually to a woman who exercises initiative in her endeavors, and in doing so brings honor to all women. Nominees may be connected to CU Boulder in some way and or be members of the Boulder community. If you have someone in mind who demonstrates these qualities, please submit your nomination by March of next year. The nomination form can be accessed on the UWC website. It's boulderuwc.org. Scholarship is at the core of the club's values, and each year the University Women's Club offers scholarships to non-traditional students whose backgrounds and life experiences have made an education difficult to complete. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce to you Marge Riddle, Chair of the Scholarship Committee. Thank you, Marge.
Thank you, Tam, and good morning. And one of the great pleasures and privileges I have had as chair of the Scholarship Committee is to read the applications of those who are applying for a UWC scholarship. As most of you know, these are non-traditional students who are at least 24 years old, whose college studies have been interrupted. Their applications always contain some information about their life journeys, as well as their career plans and life goals. The scholarships that we award, of course, depend on your donations. So today, I wanted to help you all get a little more personal feel for what your donations do. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the life story of one of our 2021 scholarship recipients, Zoe Kouromenos, whose picture you see. Zoe is a first-generation American whose father was an immigrant from Greece. She is the first in her family to attend college. The financial circumstances of her family resulted in her having to support herself and her education since the age of 17. She relates that it took her 6 years to earn her first 2-year degree, working as a nanny during some of this time, which required getting to work at 4 a.m. and doing assignments during nap time and in the evenings. In the course of doing this, however, she developed an interest in families and children and realized she wanted far more than this 2-year degree. Specifically, she set a goal of becoming a pediatrician. Then, with amazing grit and energy and true entrepreneurial spirit, she next founded her own organic cleaning company and says that she has been, quote, cleaning houses while listening to my lectures for many years now, end quote, while working on her bachelor's degree in pursuit of her eventual goal. She explained that when working as a nanny, she came to understand how unique each family is, so that among her goals as a pediatrician is to recognize that different parents may need to be approached differently to best meet their needs and support them in raising healthy and successful children. She also says that another important goal, once she has her medical degree, is to volunteer to be of service in underprivileged communities. I've said this many times, but it is a point worth repeating, that the impact of your donations to help these talented and determined students be successful thus gets multiplied many times, as so many of our students, having experienced firsthand difficult circumstances, want to, in their future lives, devote themselves to giving back in broad variety of ways. So for many of these students, these personal experiences with the importance of a hand up fuels their dedication to give back where they have been given to. Without the little donation bag at the center of your lecture luncheon table, our committee is again concerned that scholarship donations may not be top of mind. But we take heart in that you all came through so wonderfully last year. So our hope is to make this another banner year, as we know there will be a new crop of wonderfully deserving students whose needs will be as great as ever. As Zoe said in my interview with her, she wants to truly thank UWC members for the scholarship, for which she is very grateful, and wants you to know that it is truly impactful for her. I'm sure that's true. Probably not many of us feel we could get the grades needed for medical school admission listening to biochemistry lectures while we are vacuuming. So a reminder that even though you are at home, it's easy to donate. Just go to the UWC website and look under scholarships. And while at the website, also look for the Support UWC section and learn how to sign up for the King Soopers and Amazon Smile charitable rewards program, which enable automatic donations to UWC. So you have an additional donation at absolutely no cost and no additional effort to you. Nothing could be easier. Okay, so now I want to turn things over to Norma Portnoy, who is co-chair of the program committee. Norma?
Thank you, Marge, and hi, everyone. I want to go over real quickly the lectures, the other 4 lectures for the year, just to entice you to sign up, and you can sign up right now. In November, our speaker is going to be talking about Colorado women who have actually made a real difference for the state, the famous, the infamous, and the ones you've never heard of. In January, famous women in science. Our speaker is going to talk about the unique obstacles that female scientists have faced, what other fields attracted them when they couldn't make the mark that they wanted to in science, plus her own experience in the biomedical field. In February, why watching modern dance is so hard, 10 hot tips to make it easier. So you will get better prepared for better dance consumption by the CU Department of Theater and Dance Chair. And then in March, a CU's Chair of Journalism Department is going to talk about the shifting narratives, how journalism's coverage of mass shootings has evolved. She's going to go back to the 1960s, taking us all the way up to the shooting at the Table Mesa King Soopers, and talk about how media coverage has changed and how journalists are trying to balance informing the public and also treating victims and survivors with an ethic of care. So you can sign up now. We are really looking forward to them because it looks like a really good lineup. Okay, so on to today. The next slide is going to tell us how you can manage yourself. So if you have questions, please click on the Q&A and enter them there. Use the everyone chat function for general messages only. And if you find your BFF, your best friend, and you want to say something to her, please do it. Just chat to that person only so that everybody else doesn't get distracted. Okay, so now we're going to go on to our lecture for today. Betsy Schwarm is very impressive. She has a very impressive resume. She's a university professor of music. She's the author of 10 books on classical music. She's a frequent pre-concert and pre-opera speaker. She is also a former classical radio announcer and producer at the vintage KVOD, called the Classical Voice of Denver. She's a very familiar voice in the Denver area classical music scene. She's known and admired for her knowledgeable yet user-friendly delivery style. Her insights have intrigued everyone from professional musicians to casual listeners. So we're going to get to hear from Betsy and get to hear a lot of really good music today for about the next hour, and then we'll do Q&A at the end. So I'm going to turn it over to Betsy right now. Thanks, Betsy.
Oh, you're welcome, Norma. Thank you for that very nice introduction. I have to smile when I hear you say that I've written 10 books, which I have. But if you go on Amazon to look for them, you'll find 9 because Amazon is being very bizarre yesterday and today and won't let me give them the 10th one that's brandy new. It will show up at some point this fall, no doubt. But with all the work I've been doing in music over the years, I've acquired an assortment of perspectives about music. I did, by the way, take music classes while I was at CU Boulder. I was mostly a history major, but I play clarinet well. So I've been able to look at it as a historian and as a performer and as someone who has hundreds of friends and colleagues who their job is to go on stage and play the music for the diversion of all of us. I get a lot of perspectives from one side and another about wonderful music in that fashion. One thing I have never acquired is how to be the critical critic, the guy who's looking for nits to pick. So I'm not going to be telling you any of the dark side stories of our composers for today. In some cases, there are some, but let's look at their lives and their contributions to the good things that humanity has managed to do. Let me pull up my PowerPoint. I have to stop the University Women's Club PowerPoints, the screen sharing, so that I can go on and give you my PowerPoint so you can see what we have. There we are. Let's see. Theoretically, you now have my PowerPoint, Classy Ladies, Women Composers of Classical Music. And I put my little bio here as I was not sure at the time I wrote the PowerPoint how much Norma was going to share, but we can go on to that. And yes, we'll have Q&A time at the end of the program. You can pass on comments throughout the program by using the Q&A area and or the chat room, but please know that while I'm talking with you, I can't stop and also read the chat room messages at the same time. And I'm certainly never going to be interrupting the music to say, oh, this person has this question. That's not very kind to the music.
Betsy, we are not seeing it yet.
You're still not seeing it. We'll try that share again. Share. Is it there now?
All good.
It's good now. Okay. Zoom and computers in general, I try to tell myself that the fact that it works at all is kind of amazing. So if it gets hung up in one place, at least it only got hung up in one place. Hopefully it won't do it again. Roles in classical music. I wanted to take a minute before we jump into our 6 ladies for our journey today to talk about classical music and different roles in classical music, because that helps us to put these ladies into context. And first of all, what is classical music? Well, in the broader sense, it is music written as a piece of art, according to the artistic standards of its time in history. And I say of its time in history because therefore what passed as fine art music when Mozart was alive is not the same as what passed as fine art music today, although composers today would be well placed to look at what he did and take what they can use from that. You also hear people talk about the classical era in music, and one of our composers today does fit in that time. Historians like to divide things into periods of history. It makes it tidy for discussion. So specifically speaking, the classical era is about 1750 to about 1820. And yet fine music has been written for centuries and centuries and centuries. So the real purists in musicology will say, oh no, of these 6 composers you're talking about today, only one of them is classical. Well, so what? If we think of classical in the broader sense of fine music written to a high artistic standard, all these folks fit. There are many ways to be involved in classical music, and what I've summed up here next on this PowerPoint is the roles that we tended to find women doing. And singers was one of the types of musical employment, musical activity that they might use. And that was one of the very first in which women got to be involved really at the same level that men were doing it. Instrumentalists as well, a little slower than that. They started singing first. After all, if you're not going to only have a boys' choir at the cathedral to sing these sacred music soprano lines, you need to have some women around. So instrumentalists do begin to come in as well. Some instruments more often than others, keyboards such as harpsichords and pianos would have been some of the first instruments that women would have been likely to pick up. Brass instruments, tubas and trombones, far, far further down the line. Teaching music as well. The very first women who were hired to teach at the Paris Conservatory were teaching music, not performing it. They all performed on the side, but they came to their public reputations first through making connections as teachers of music. And I've added there next, later composers. Why later? Why were they not composing as soon as they were singing or playing an instrument or teaching? Well, some of them were, but the trick was to get the attention for what they were doing and be able to get their music out before the public. It's one thing to sit in your studio and write a piece of music and set it nicely on the shelf, maybe in a file cabinet drawer, and then another and another, but you want the world to hear it. And in many countries, it was a little slow, the progress of women who were writing music, getting their music before the public. Some areas, it happened more easily. And even back in the Baroque era and the Renaissance era, Italian communities of certain cities brought women out to the public. And that's also true in Paris. Not so much, for example, in Germany or in England or in the United States. So I've arranged our 6 composers in chronological order, and the first of them are from Italy and then from France, because women composers got a quicker start there. So why were they not being encouraged to compose music earlier? Well, again, a lot of them were composing, they just weren't getting it out in the public. There was an idea that some people carried in many countries that, oh, women can't do that, their brains aren't designed for that. We all know that that's not true, but that was what was being widely said. There are all kinds of careers one could list off that, oh, it was long said that women couldn't possibly do that, but yes, they can. And I got to thinking of the issue as to whether there are more male composers or more female composers or more of a balance. It varies depending on what city, what country, what community one's looking at how one defines composers. Are you a composer if you wrote music, but it's only ever been heard by your friends and family? Well, you're still a composer, aren't you? It turns out that both for women composers and for men composers, there are 3 main things that play a role into how far they get with their career. And I summed it up in 3 words: aptitude, inclination, and opportunity. Certainly, a composer of either gender needs to have an aptitude for the field, not just a simple knowledge of it, but an idea of how to use these rules and these expectations to create a piece of music worth hearing. So the aptitude needs to be there, but also the inclination. You need to want to do it. Inclination without aptitude will get you nowhere. Aptitude without inclination won't get you much further. If somebody would actually really rather do something else other than music, doesn't matter how good he or she would be at it, they're not going to make much of a career out of it. The last issue, one that affects men and women in almost any field, but we're talking about classical music today, is opportunity. The chance to get your creations out there and for people to notice and pay attention to what you're doing. So if you don't have all 3 of those things, it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, you're not going to make it very far in classical music or in many, many fields. These 6 women composers I've chosen for our program today from 6 different communities all had the aptitude. They were musically inclined in the first place, but they also then set out, sometimes under parental encouragement, to study how to make something lasting out of that music. Not just entertain your friends and family, but make something big and important. And all of them in various ways had the connections of opportunity to get their music out in public. That matters because if their music's not out in public, it's probably not going to last in time because people just aren't going to see it and hear it. And they won't be remembered in the long run of time. Some of the composers we'll talk about today, it's a long, long run of time. Others of them are still around today. We're going to start out in Florence, Italy, and then move on to Paris, and then to Leipzig, and then cross the Atlantic and come to Boston, and then Little Rock, yes, Arkansas, and then off to Berkeley, the one that's in California, as to various other Berkeleys. So we have 6 different composers, and the last of our composers is still up today. I am also going to take a little time toward the end of my presentation to tell you about the concert that CU is offering of women composers this evening. And I didn't, by happenstance, include either of those composers on today's program, but I'm familiar with both of their music, and I think I've cleared space in my own calendar this evening to be able to check in on the online broadcast of that. So we're starting off in the Italian Baroque. Baroque is one of those musical words for defining a particular period in history, a time in which everyone who was working in this field tended to use some of the same ideas in the same time, in the same places. And that counts for Barbara Strozzi. And unless you lived in Florence, you might not have heard of her at the time, but a fair amount of her music has survived, several dozen songs, and some of them quite ambitious. She is one who had opportunity to go with her inclination and her aptitude. Barbara Strozzi is from Florence, Italy. And it happens that Florence was one of the great centers of artistic, historic, cultural activity in Northern Italy. Northern Italy and Southern Italy and Central Italy. They were not a united country. So it's important to say Florence and Northern Italy because they do not unite until 1861. At this time, Florence was its own place, and Barbara had the good fortune to be there. She had the even better fortune that she was adopted as an orphan by Giulio Strozzi, who was a prominent and influential writer in Florence at the time. And he adopted her, saw to it that she had training in the arts, in writing, in composing, in visual arts as well. And he is especially notable in this context in that he had lots of connections within the artistic world and the musical world, and held frequent gatherings at his home where they called them academies. And everybody who was anybody in the arts in Florence would make a point of attending those academies to hear music, to talk about music and visual arts, share a few bottles of wine perhaps. And Barbara, once she reached an age of being more acceptable in terms of having something she might be willing to contribute and able to contribute to these conversations, began attending these academies there in Florence and began having her music performed there for the movers and shakers in the artistic world in Florence. What I have brought for us to hear as an example of Barbara's music, but also therefore of Italian Baroque music as a whole, is one of her songs. Most often in classical music, a song is a short work setting a poem so that it can be sung with instrumental accompaniment, usually one singer and one pianist. Well, there's no pianist in Barbara's music because the piano itself hasn't been invented yet. The harpsichord's there, but she did not always use it in her compositions. We'll also find that she was not writing things for just one singer. She was writing pieces that she thought the gathering at the Academy would enjoy performing all together. So there's more than one vocal line, and she had to make all these different vocal lines work together. The text of the poem that she has chosen here happens to be written by her adoptive father, by Giulio Strozzi. And it is Vecchio Amante, old lover. And that could be a terribly sad sort of title, couldn't, for someone who is just, alas, and giving up and failing at what he's trying to do. That's not the approach that Giulio Strozzi took with the poem that he wrote. He writes, I surrender love. I surrender to the injuries of years. I see the arms of time arrayed against me. I surrender, as if he's giving up. But the music doesn't really sound surrendery. He goes on in different verses, remarking upon how his eyesight is not as good as it used to be, or he isn't as nimble as he used to be. And he's beginning to feel that maybe he's not up to the adventures of love anymore, but he has not given up. And I asked Norma to send out so that you could have it without my occupying 25 PowerPoint slides with the Italian text and English translation, the text of the piece. But what I have read to you summarizes the point of view that he's giving up on love is not going to be an everyday part of my life, but he hasn't given up as well. He says later in the poem, speak clearly and let it suffice that new disputes do not arise in the end, for I see that the enemy is quarrelsome. He's going to go on. He's going to kind of try to avoid the enemy. I've put on our PowerPoint slides also the names of the performers and the performing ensembles that we'll be hearing. So if you'd like to acquire recordings, you can track them down. It doesn't necessarily have to be a little round piece of plastic on the shelf. You can find almost anything online. And many of these pieces, whether or not I bought them in the first place from iTunes, I checked that, yes, they are there, that you could go get them if you would like. So Cappella Mediterranea will be performing the song Vecchio Amante, Old Lover, by Barbara Strozzi. Let us have the music.
Senza gloria non sia, pria che estinto, io mi veggia. Amor, 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 amor per me patteggia. La raccatte il mio cuore, tutti ha perdute, ormai li difesi di fuori. Ai balconi del volto l'uso del lume è colto. Di mia bocca son state le macchine atterrate. Ogni duro si scotti e per la breccia di rosinote l'ultimo salto apparecchiato io cedo amor, io cedo pria che estinto io mi veggia. Così per me, così per me il micciotel si voglio primeramente resti acceso all'uscire. La speme porti al vero, poco magari sera. Al mio coraggio, rocca, portarmi ragione vuol la memoria un piccolo cannone, la memoria sol, ecco io mi freddo. Io cedo amor, io cedo, pria che estinto, io mi veggia. Così per me patteggia. Ancor sarà dovere marciare, marciare in ordinanza, a spiegare
I don't think it sounds like the music of a guy who's actually given up on love. He's putting on a brave front that, well, yes, I know you tell me I should stop this, but it's still very bright, very spirited. And it's pretty ambitious that Barbara Strozzi wrote several instrumental parts into the music and different vocal lines as well. We were hearing it sung by two different gentlemen, and that plus the instrumental accompaniment makes it a fairly complex piece. Yes, her music was only being heard at these private academies that her father was giving, but her talent was spoken of highly throughout the artistic community in Florence, and that was a very rich artistic community. They paid attention to what was happening in the world of music, and they welcomed Barbara as someone who had something to say in the world of music. Did she pursue a professional career in it? Well, she did not, but there were not a lot of women pursuing professional careers in much of any field at the time. So we've started our program in Italy, and off we go now to Paris for Hélène de Montgeroux. Her dates, 1764 to 1836, put smack in the riddle of her life, the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror. She had, when she was a girl, learned piano, performing, but also learning how to compose, especially for the piano. We will shortly be hearing one of her solo piano pieces that she composed. Her family had connections in the aristocratic circles in France, and she married shortly before the French Revolution started. And as you'll recall, it was then becoming not a place to be if you were an aristocrat, because during the Reign of Terror, being an aristocrat was grounds for arrest and probably your death. So she was already married to a nobleman. The French Revolution broke out, the Reign of Terror immediately followed, and her husband, being an aristocrat, was arrested. He went off to prison and never did emerge again. Hélène might have gotten arrested in that, well, she was his wife and her own family had aristocratic connections. But when they came to take custody of her to question her as to whether she should be imprisoned or not, there happened to be a piano in the room. And Hélène said, I am a revolutionary as you. I believe that the people should have a voice in their days and in their lives. Let me show you. And she went over to the piano and sat down, and with no sheet music in front of her, began playing the Marseillaise, the French anthem, and then began creating variations on it, dressing it up in different ways for different moods and emotions off the top of her head. Perhaps she had practiced such things in advance, but did she know that on this day they were going to show up and she'd have to defend herself with music? Probably not, but it worked. And not only were they impressed that she is one of us, but they also said, oh, and she has been contributing something beyond just being an aristocrat's wife. She has been contributing to our society with the gift of music. So Hélène survived where her husband did not, and went on with a musical career, performing on first the harpsichord, but by this time, by the time of the Revolution, the piano had spread to wide popularity. She was invited to teach at the Paris Conservatory, the Paris Conservatoire, to teach piano there. She was not taken into the composition staff, but at the time that she was working at the Paris Conservatory, they were more interested in training performers than in training composers. So there wasn't much of a composing staff anyway at the conservatory in those first years. Hélène, being busy with teaching and with performing, did not compose as much music as she might have otherwise done, but several dozen of her pieces have survived, especially her solo piano sonatas. And we're going to hear one movement from one of them, from her piano sonata number 3. As Mozart or Beethoven or Haydn or any of the great masters of the day, including the French masters of her own generation, such as Jean-Philippe Rameau, would have done, it's in several different movements, in this case 3, which was the most popular number. Each of them intended to be in a different mood, in a different tempo, a different level of energy for the sake of contrast. And I've chosen the last movement of it. And she has headed this last movement with the musical term presto, meaning fast and zippy. I think it's pretty fast and zippy indeed. So Edna Stern performs for us the last movement of the Piano Sonata number 9 of Hélène de Montgeroux. Helene de Montgerot was a contemporary of two much better known names, Mozart and Beethoven. She is 8 years younger than Mozart and is 6 years older than Beethoven. So she sits right between the two of them. And she is writing in musical styles that both of them would have used. Beethoven comes to write and perform, if we go by newspaper accounts and those of his friends and colleagues who had heard him play. Beethoven tended to take those forms and styles and ideas and use them in sort of a heavy fashion, a very formidable kind of style. You don't really hear a lot of formidableness in Helene de Montgerot's music. She's leaning a little more to the slightly earlier Mozart style. And it isn't that she's a girl. It's that that was what was more popular in France. In France, they were not yet interested in these stronger, more dramatic emotions that were developing over in Vienna. The Parisians catch on to it, but at the time that Helene de Montgerot was writing this music, they still liked the earlier kind of lighter, not delicate, but quicker and a little bit brighter sounding styles. That's what they were trying to do in their music in general, the French composers were. And Helene is very much in that same school of thought. The third of our 6 composers for our program today is perhaps the most famous of all female composers, performers throughout all of great music history, and that is Clara Wieck Schumann. She was born in Leipzig, and her father, Ferdinand Wieck, W-I-E-C-K, was a piano teacher who was sure that he had developed the method of teaching the best pianist in the world to take someone who was malleable, soft clay and train them to be the world's most perfect pianist. He used his daughter Clara to establish his reputation, was apparently his plan, because he kept discouraging Clara from reaching out at first. He wanted her to show and demonstrate that he knew how to train a pianist. And he had her by the age of 10 traveling to the capitals of Europe to perform music of Beethoven, who was at that point still only very recently departed. So Father Wieck was showing that his daughter, having been trained by him, could manage this immensely difficult music. He also had her doing composition training in her childhood years, because it was expected that a pianist would be able to write some of his or her own pieces to include them in a recital. So Clara was composing from early on. And she was an international star from early on, well before she reached her teens. Clara Wieck was a name to be known in the world of music. She met Robert Schumann, who is not a native of Leipzig, but is from Germany, when she was 16 and Robert was 25. Robert had come to take piano lessons with Clara's father. He gave up those lessons after a while when Robert decided that he was really into composing and being a music journalist, that playing the piano really wasn't his thing. But he had hung around at the Wieck house often enough to get to know Clara rather well. They fell in love and they wished to marry. Robert went to Clara's father to ask for her hand in marriage. And Clara's father basically pitched a fit, saying, "You're only wanting to marry my daughter because she will be a superstar of the piano and you want her income from that." By the way, who do you think was collecting Clara's income so far? It was Dad. Dad did not want to lose the golden goose to Robert. So Dad tried to keep them apart. Finally, Robert went to the legal courts to get permission to marry Clara despite her father's wishes. Why didn't they just go get married anyway without his opinion, without the father getting a vote? Because in the German state of Saxony, where Leipzig is, at that time, you could not marry without your parents' permission until you were 21. And Clara was still in her late teens. So they got permission of the courts. They married in 1840, literally the day before her 21st birthday. And they were together till the end of Robert's life. Clara lives on another 40 years after Robert's passing and continues to be one of the great pianists performing throughout Europe. She also, by the way, established something of a reputation as a composer. And we'll hear a bit of some of her music in a moment. But Clara did something that Helene de Montgerot and Barbara Strozzi did not have as a complication in their lives. Clara had married and had 7 children. And if we compare the birth dates of their children to the concert dates that Clara was performing, not just at home in Leipzig, but throughout all of Europe, throughout her life, she was often on the road traveling for her next concert when she was 5 and 6 months pregnant. That can't have been easy on the primitive trains of the time. So she had a family life and a career. And that is one of the things that not a lot of the women composers in her generation were doing. If they were performers, they performed in their hometown, hopefully a place like Paris or Vienna. Once they started having children, they were expected to stay home. But Robert, being a music lover himself and working in the world of music, appreciated Clara's musical gifts. He liked her to be taking concert tours because honestly, it brought in money into the house. He did not mind her composing, especially for little things for the entertainment of the family and their friends. And that's the case with her 3 violin romances. They are solo pieces, not totally solo, but they are recital pieces for violin and piano. Some of you have noticed on the screen that I wrote viola for Philip Stevens. Yes, Philip is a violist. And although Clara wrote them for violin and piano, planning to perform them with a violinist friend of theirs, that she would play the piano part and Josef Joachim would play the violin part. They have been transcribed because violists adore them and want to play them. Philip Stevens and Sarah Parkinson are people I actually know personally. They work here in the Denver area music community. Philip teaches at Metropolitan State University of Denver, and Sarah works with the Boulder Philharmonic. And this is an excerpt from a concert that they gave a couple years ago at the Lone Tree Arts Center on the south side of Denver. Let's hear the last of the 3 romances by Clara Wieck Schumann. She wrote on the heading of the first page of this one that she wanted it played passionately. And it's pretty dramatic, exciting stuff for just 2 players. of the real tricks in writing, let alone performing chamber music for small groups of players, is to keep the 2 or 3 or 4, however many there are, instruments in balance, that nobody's really the star and the other person the backup band, that the 2 of them each have to contribute something worthwhile to the music. And Clara has done that very well with her romances. She also did write a multi-movement piano concerto, a big work, and an assortment of solo piano pieces. She did not compose as much as our next lady, Amy Beach, but Clara had 7 children, and even with a housekeeper, that's a lot of people to look after. She was kept quite busy with that. So having started in Florence and then gone to Paris and then to Leipzig, let us come over to Boston for the first of 3 American women composers we'll be talking about today. That is Amy Chaney Beach. As Amy Chaney, she was growing up in a prosperous family that was devoted to music. Both her mother and her father sang in amateur choral societies in Boston. Amy was given music lessons, first at the piano, and then they thought, oh, let's let her study a bit of composition as well. They did not send her off to a conservatory to study music. They brought in a private teacher for her. Her male colleagues of her own generation were getting on the boat, going over to Europe and studying in Berlin or in Paris. Amy stayed home in Boston, but learned a lot about music and built a great career out of it. She had her first symphony premiered by the Boston Symphony Orchestra. And then somewhat later, a year or so later, in 1900, she had her first piano concerto performed in Boston by the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and she was a soloist. They're big, ambitious, dramatic works. And both of those works, as well as a lot of her other compositions, solo piano and songs and chamber music, developed an international acceptance. She was considered not just a lady composer, but an American composer of unusual skill and dexterity, who happens to be a woman. She might have composed less music had her life taken a slightly different path. And this is not a sad story, it's just the way her career developed. She met a friend of her parents, Henry Harris Beach. And Henry was a medical doctor who also sang in those choral societies with her parents. And although he's quite a bit older than Amy, they married when she was not quite 20. And Amy gave up performing in public other than for charity performances. Charity performances is something that a society wife would be expected to do. But to have a career traveling and playing on the stage in front of the public, Dr. Beach said to his new bride that, I would rather you did not do that. So alas, she was not traveling and performing for live audiences. But as it happens, she and Dr. Beach did not have any children of their own. So she had a lot of time on her hands, aristocratic, wealthy society lady who did not have a job, but had plenty of musical interest and spent a lot of time in her studio composing music that was published widely. After her husband died, he was again quite a bit older than she, so he died while she was still a rather young woman. And she then organized for herself a concert tour to go to Europe for several months and perform in Paris, in Vienna, in all the great capitals of Europe, where the newspapers said that she is a great talent. Too bad we haven't seen her until now. Let us hear one movement from Amy Beach's piano concerto. It's in the formidable key of C sharp minor, but we have a cheerful movement out of the middle of it. Scherzo is a musical word that in the literal Italian means a joke, but it's not necessarily a joke, haha, funny. No, a scherzo is usually light, bright, and quick moving. And her scherzo from the second movement of her piano concerto certainly does that. She wrote and premiered the piece with the Boston Symphony Orchestra and played it in concert once she got around to doing her European tour quite belatedly. But at least she had a chance to see that, people do love my music. Let's hear the scherzo movement from the piano concerto of Amy Beach. At a time in history where especially the French women composers, but also the Germans and the English were being encouraged to write big, ambitious stuff, American women of Amy Beach's generation were supposed to write little songs and solo piano pieces. She thought big too, having written a symphony and a piano concerto. And if we had the time to hear this concerto all the way through, there's a lot of high drama in it. She very much knew how to get impact and effect out of music. Our next composer is also an American. Our last two composers of our program will be American. Florence Smith Price, who had several strikes against her in terms of having a successful music career. And none of those strikes against her have anything to do with her ability. Just how do you get your music out to the public? For one, yes, she's a woman. And many people even in the music community until the last 40 odd years have thought that, well, women should go have families and raise children. They don't need a career. So being a woman is only one of her handicaps. Another of her handicap is that she's from Little Rock, Arkansas, at a time where most of the most accepted, most admired classical music coming out of the US is coming out of New England. Florence is from Little Rock, Arkansas, which is not the musical capital of anything. So she will need to, as it happens in this case successfully, get up and leave Little Rock. The third thing against her in terms of pursuing a career is that she's African American. That fact does not diminish her skill, just an acceptance level. In her generation, even the guys in classical music tended to be Anglo. But Florence does go on and make a successful career for herself. Her parents were middle class, but relatively prosperous. Dad was a medical doctor, and both mom and dad loved music. She grew up listening to dad's phonograph records and going to concerts when some were available and thinking, I would love to do music. I would at least love to study music and be able to do something with it. And she got her parents' permission to leave Little Rock and go off to Boston for the New England Conservatory of Music, where her first plan was to learn piano and organ and build for herself a career as a church organist. She said, I would love to do that. But she attracted the attention of the composition faculty at the New England Conservatory. They began inviting her to come sit in on their classes, and she found that, oh, I like this too, this is good. And she learned how to compose symphonies, chamber music, piano music, hymns, and so on, and ended up doing that rather than being a church organist. After her graduation from the conservatory, she first went back to Little Rock, but then she married, and her husband suggested, why don't we get out of the South? Let's get up to Chicago, where Blacks have more potential for advancement and success than they would in the Old South. So off they went to Chicago, and that was her home base for most of her career. She wrote 4 symphonies during their years in Chicago, and nearly all of them were premiered by Chicago professional orchestras, not just a group of students, for example, during the 1930s and the 1940s. And we're going to hear the last movement of her Symphony No. 3, this one from 1940. It was a performance that was sponsored by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. Think FDR, putting money into getting people back to work. And that doesn't just mean factories and road building, that also included the arts. And concerts were being sponsored not only in Chicago, but Chicago, our example at the moment, so as to get those musicians out there earning some money. And by the way, let's provide some music that people can go and hear and enjoy that, so they can see what their funds that are through the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, is achieving. So it was a pretty high profile occasion when her Symphony No. 3 premiered. Let's hear a performance of the last movement. Again, a scherzo. We had that same word with the Amy Beach Piano Concerto movement we heard, that they were supposed to be bright and spirited and lots of energy. It certainly has a lot of energy. Last movement of Florence Smith Price's Symphony No. 3. Big dramatic stuff from Florence Smith Price. We had a question as to how often music of these women composers get performed in public, not just recorded and talked about, but do they get performed? Interesting to get that timing on that question as we're hearing Florence Price, because she's going to be performed by the Colorado Symphony this season. Not her Symphony No. 3, but rather an orchestral piece of program music, it's kind of musical tapestry with views and imagery in mind. It's her composition, The Oaks. And the Colorado Symphony will be playing it the weekend of March 25th, matching it on a program with The Planets by Gustav Holst. Why put those two works together? Because Holst's composition needs a big symphony orchestra, and so does Florence Price's. So she is thinking ambitiously, not writing for smaller ensembles only, but writing bigger, grander pieces. As for the other composers I've talked about today, and we have one more yet to come, Clara Schumann's music does not generally lack audiences, especially her many, many solo piano pieces. It helps that she was married to an important composer and that they were close friends with some of the biggest names in the music business at the time, such as Johannes Brahms, whose letters seem to suggest that he is sorry that by the time he met her, she was already married with children because he loved her. But they remained close throughout their lives. So Clara Schumann is well connected enough to have the opportunity to get her music performed, even now, long after her passing. And our last composer of today, the one who is still with us and still actively working, does not lack for audiences for her music because she's around to promote her music herself, and that is Gabriela Lina Frank. Born in Berkeley, of Peruvian, Chinese, and Lithuanian descent. So she's American born, but like a lot of Americans, she has a lot of roots back there in her family line. And she has been called a musical anthropologist. She is fascinated by the notion of evoking the roots of her family through her music. And the Chinese and Lithuanian connections don't so much come up in the Frank piece that we're about to sample, but certainly the Peruvian ones, her 3 Latin American sketches that she composed in 2004. It's a 3-movement orchestral suite, no main soloist, but here and there, individual instruments might get a brief solo appearance. The first movement is inspired by the music of the Amazonian regions. And yes, in her notes for the piece, Gabriela does observe that, yes, there are many different cultures in the Amazon, but it's that general spirit that I want in this first movement. The second movement goes to the Peruvian highlands. And the third movement takes a broader view, mestizo waltz, she says, and she says in her own written notes correctly that mestizo is a word used for persons of mixed race, no specific race, just more than one. And she wanted to write something that would take the rhythms of many different cultures, and as those cultures might be mixed in an individual such as herself, she wants to mix those musical ideas into a single movement, her mestizo waltz, with the Utah Symphony and Keith Lockhart conducting. I thought it was bright and spirited enough to make a good conclusion to our program. When I was asked to do a 1-hour program on women composers of classical music, the challenge was in part who to keep on the list and who to shove aside. Maybe someday I can do another program for you with another half dozen women composers. But these have been some of the top names that I wanted to bring attention to. Clara Schumann and Amy Beach are fairly frequently performed. The others, not as much, but Gabriella Lena Frank is getting her music performed a lot. It helps if she can call some orchestra up or some chamber group up and say, I'd love for you to do this. I wrote it for you. And that keeps the music out in the public. Women composers throughout the generations are not more or less skilled than the guys. They bring their own particular points of view. And it's great to be able to hear and see what they're up to in music. So I'm going to pass things back to Norma, so we can go on to whatever questions and answers you or Norma, for that matter, might have. I'll have
Awesome.
the answers. You can have the questions.
Well, first, thank you so much, Betsy. That was so fascinating. You are just such an expert, and I truly enjoyed the music and all the information you shared. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so we've got about 4 or 5 questions. Generally, which countries have been more accepting of female composers compared to other countries? Can you narrow it down?
I can narrow it down best to 2 particular ones, and one is France, and the other, but more recently in the past 60 odd years, is the US. There have been some British women composers who are starting to make a mark. Judith Bingham comes to mind. And there are women composers in some numbers in most countries one could name who have made careers. But as to most accepting, the French headed the list. And the Americans are working on catching up with that. But I think for about the last 50, 60 years, we're pulling even with the French.
Got it. Awesome. Okay, let's see. Here's another one. As I listen to these works, I would be hard pressed to say whether the composer was male or female. Is this an issue today, or is the music evaluated on its own by those who accept it for performance, say by a major orchestra?
The clever major orchestras or major performing groups or vocal soloists will accept it on its own, not necessarily because it's men or women. And I can say, I would agree that very little of the way of music really sounds like, oh, a guy must have written that, or, oh yeah, a woman wrote that. I can tell. It tends not to be particularly clear. If I played Gabriella Lena Frank's Mestizo Waltz for you, you might guess that it's sort of Central American in mood, but there's nothing female-like about it or male-like about it. And I think that's a mark of respect, that they can be accepted on their own, not just for being guys or girls. Now, I will say that a fair number of female composers attract notice because maybe an orchestra is thinking, we haven't played any women lately, who can we find? And they'll go look up some female composers and then choose from the excellence of the music. I think right now being a female composer may be an advantage, because more and more orchestras or chamber groups are thinking, yeah, we ought to play some women. Let's go find some.
Got it. Got it. Okay, here's another one. It seems that there's been a change in the arguments that are made by those promoting equal opportunities for women in the arts. The original argument was that women were as accomplished as the men. Now we often hear that women bring a different view or sensibility to the art. What do you think of these 2 opinions?
The interesting thing about those 2 opinions is that it's not, those are opinions that one hears being raised, not just men versus women, but persons of different races or different ethnic backgrounds. That does an African-American composer bring a different perspective to his music? He probably does. Does a woman bring different perspective to her music? She possibly does. I think it depends mostly on to what experiences the individual composer has been exposed as to whether you can hear that coming out in their music. But some of it will also be, what are they hoping to do with their music? Do they want it to be obvious that, yes, a woman wrote this? And how do you make something sound like a woman wrote it? That's kind of hard to say. It's not like you could just wrap it up in pink ribbon and say, oh, look, a woman wrote it. Does it sound like a woman wrote it? Not necessarily. And Clara Schumann or Amy Beach, both of them wrote some quiet, delicate pieces that you might say were clearly by a woman. But you know what? Frédéric Chopin wrote some quiet, pretty pieces as well. So I don't think it's immediately obvious with very many pieces that a guy wrote it or a girl wrote it. They can go out of their way to make it sound that way, but what sounds female? Hard to say.
Got it. So looking in past centuries, formal education in music must have been quite costly. So is it your impression that all the female composers during the past centuries came from families with money and privilege?
I would say the ones with money and privilege were somewhat, saying that very measuredly, somewhat more likely to say, well, yes, and she can go off and take these experiences and make of them what she would like. Certainly women, girls growing up in a working class family would not have had much opportunity to learn about music. But even in the middle classes and even by the mid to late 1700s, it was expected that music should be part of everyone's education. And especially girls were expected to be able to sing adequately, play the piano adequately, if nothing else, to entertain their friends and family. And if she then has within her that inclination that I want to make more of this, she might push to go on to more. But being extremely wealthy would not necessarily be an advantage. Amy Beach did grow up in a prosperous family, and that gave her exposure to an advantage of connections that others might not have had. But Clara Schumann's dad was a piano teacher. They tend not to be rich, but he encouraged her musical abilities. So I think what's going on with outside the head and the heart of the young lady in question and her parents is important, but being wealthy is not necessarily a crucial factor. It does help to have the money to be able to travel and get your music performed. That helps, but it's not necessarily only a criterion.
All right. Okay, I have one last question.
Yes.
In the past centuries, did male musicians, the violinists, the cellists, etc., did they, or maybe you know this or not, did they have a problem playing the music by female composers? Were they prejudiced against the female composers' music?
Very, very few of them would go on the record at their time and have said, I'm not going to play her, she's a girl. So, and especially today, that would be career suicide to say, no, I refuse to play women's music. But what we can say is that for some women composers, they were well connected enough that the guys would say, oh, I will absolutely play her music. Why? Well, because they know her personally, and they had had a chance to observe that her music was as good as the guys. Clara Schumann was close personal friends for 50 years with Johannes Brahms. She played his music on her recitals, he played hers. So some composers possibly will have had difficulty, and it seems that one person who comes up in that list, not as a personal handicap, but it was a tripping point for her for a while, was the English composer and violist Rebecca Clark. And the English seem to have some idea that, oh, she should go do something else and not try to be a professional musician. Then again, in England, in Rebecca Clark's lifetime, and she was born in 1886, so we're talking the Edwardian time, she was a member of an all-female orchestra that attracted a lot of favorable attention in England. Not only were they really, really good, it was also a certain novelty that, wow, a whole orchestra of women, I want to hear that. So that's early 20th century, but they were beginning to be more open to that.
Got it. Got it. All right. Those are all of our questions. I just wanted to remind everyone that at the conclusion of today's lecture, you'll get an email from us with information about the concert works of 2 different female composers will be played, and you can attend it virtually or in person. So you'll get an email with that information. And I just wanted to thank Betsy one more time because it was awesome. I learned so much. It was fascinating learning about the lives of these women.
Yes.
The only problem is now I feel like a real slouch. Anyways, it was really, especially Clara being a world famous composer and having 7 children. Oh my gosh. Anyway,
Both those is pretty astonishing.
Yeah.
And the recital this evening at Ibig Music School, I would have put Jennifer Higdon on this program had I not already put Gabriella Lena Frank there. And I thought leaving Gabriella there lets me bring up the point that it's cross-cultural music. So sorry, Jennifer, who I have met personally and interviewed on the radio. Sorry, but I couldn't fit her in there.
Okay, awesome. All right. Well, thank you again so very much.
You're welcome.
Everyone enjoyed this. And I'm going to turn the gavel back over to Tam, our president.
Thank you so much for everyone for your attendance today at this extremely interesting and lecture, and for supporting UWC through your involvement in our programming and commitment to all of the scholarship that we are offering to unconventional students. We hope to see you at the November webinar, and we'll learn more about Colorado women at that time, the famous, the infamous, and the ones you've never heard of. Until then, enjoy our beautiful, although ever changing, Colorado fall weather. Thank you for attending.